Illness and Cure, Chapter 7, Thinking and Unthinking. However closely an individual adheres to the specialized contempt of thinking, he also ultimately uses the theoretical methods of his adversaries. The notion of his inadvertent uses of various gestures of thinking came rather early to me when I was studying philosophy. My teacher, an ardent Hegelian, was well known in professional circles. From time to time, he invited his students to his home for tea, and in his informal atmosphere, he was completely different from the man we knew in the classroom. He did not speak of ex cathedra, but became much more friendly and open, giving us wild explanation about how he had formulated some of his theories. He told us, for instance, that his keenest thinking happened when he was sitting on the toilet creating some biological production. With my newly acquired psychoanalytic sophistication, I related these remarks for some Freud's biogenic explanations. About a colleague who has an ardent psychomonist, my professor who never expresses any appreciation until he had the experience of spending a few days as the man's guest. Then he found himself admiring his host for the huge number of books he possessed. Suddenly, in the midst of a discussion, my teacher would stop and say, "Now, I am reasoning just like my theoretical enemies." He was aware that from time to time, he outwittingly took over the logic of his adversaries. Most of us do this. We unconsciously adhere to the concepts we ourselves consciously believe, but also, often unknowingly, use the thoughts of others. If one were to analyze the tape recording of a discussion carried on a meeting of philosophers, it would be possible to detect not only the topmost thinking of the speakers, but also the side thoughts in which the unthinking adopted the logic in their adversaries. We would note the petty pouting of those who cannot win the verbal battle, the crude materialism of those who use mere weight of voice, the naive idealism of those who stick one keyword, believing that quick words and repetitive will convince others. Our keenest thinking is put into action during a discussion, but at the same time, there is a lot of unthinking going on because we are all caught up in our own habits, our own ways of argument, our need to oppose our reliance on two-valued thinking. When I am right, he cannot be right. Thinking as a fatal luxury. The psychologist approaches the process of thinking differently than the philosopher. The former often finds the emphasis on logic and reason weakening maintains on reality. Life is not clearly logical and simply determined. Rigid logic prevails only in the rule-ridden world of the insect. Ideas and concepts often spring forth illogically. Idle play, sleep, and other states of partial awareness are fertile soils of the germination of ideas. The determination to think logically is not sufficient for production of thought. The mind requires the creative power of passion to produce. The scrupulous application of the laws of logic and reason is not an adequate guide for the solution of life's problems. Reason merely assists in the avoidance of major errors. The practical question in the world is how to manage unreason. The psychologist looks upon thinking as a mysterious biological luxury largely limited to human species. It is related to an ambition of vital functions replacing instinctual actions and accompanied by curious, self-examining consciousness. The anatomist Bolk metamorphically ascribed the peculiar biological inhibition and retardations of functioning to the relaxed posture of man, his long youth and dependency, and his never-ceasing play. Because man remains an unprotected fetus for so long, his physical defenses do not develop and differentiate adequately, and his forebrain and the opportunity to develop as a useful instrument of consciousness. Fertilization and retardation in biological development provide man the opportunity for thinking as a new adaptation to reality. Janet was one of the first to call the attention of psychologists to what we call the reality function. He speaks of a mental tension and force in man, the highest perfection of which the reality function. When this tension and alertness diminishes, certain mental characteristics disappear. The first quality to weaken is the man's capacity for adjustment to changing reality. The immediate experience of, insight into, and enjoyment of reality is a highly differentiated and vulnerable mental activity. Mature man, confronting reality, must make nearly continual adjustment. Keep DM enjoy the day is a vulnerable function. For many people, enjoyment comes only in remembering an experience while they recount it to others. Having been too exhausted or too preoccupied to enjoy a supreme moment when it actually happened. Many thinkers and dreamers also withdraw into meditation simply because they cannot grasp or bear the tension of reality. Frenzy was one of the first to describe several phases in the development of reality adaptation, which he called the sense of reality. To understand Frenzy's deductions, we must give up the idea of identical thinking procedures taking place in all minds. Sometimes people do think identically, at other times, our minds operate altogether differently. But some regularity can be found even in the irregularity when thinking is looked at from different mental standpoints. The idea of stratification of consciousness and the existence of various levels of mental activity is a very old concept. One finds it in the Upanishads, and the Paracues had an inkling of such a hierarchical order. Spinoza theorized about the idea of passion changing the aspect of passion by elevating it to different levels of awareness. Carus described the nightshade of the soul. Schizophrenia and Nietzsche wrote about unconscious mental activity and about the surface and the depth of thinking. But Freud and his students elaborated the idea into workable hypotheses for elaborate clinical exploration and methodology. According to Ferenczi, the stratification process begins before birth during intrauterine life with a phase of unconscious mnemic activity. Some sensory activity must take place, for there exists, for example, an intrauterine reaction to sounds and pressure. But nothing is consciously remembered. The fetus perhaps experiences, as it were, a feeling of certified omnipotence, which has been compared by several authors to the oceanic and navic feelings described in literature. After birth, there is a stage of magical hallucinatory experience in which no distinction is drawn between the inner and the outer world. The infant still experiences himself as omnipotent, as managing the world with magical gestures. Inanimate objects are just as alive to him as the people. Out of gestural thinking and the testing of reality with the whole body, there develops a critical animistic form of thinking in which qualities of the self are alluded and to projected upon the outside world. This animistic thinking is of passive nature. Inside thoughts and feelings are experienced as preyed upon and directed by father, mother, and siblings. Mythology is filled with illusion to being influenced and with the personification of inanimate objects. The next stage of magical thinking is a more active confrontation of reality. This is a form of primitive strategy in which the fancied spirits of objects are manipulated. The magic action or inaction attempts to seduce the spirits into being good and obedient. Man's inner and outer world begin to separate while his magic thoughts serve to maintain contact between the two. In these early stages of thinking, the main influences emanate from outer world, overwhelming the experienced subject. In these early stages of thinking, the main influences emanate from the outer world, overwhelming the experiencing of subject. The feeling of loss and helplessness at this stage is comparable with what we may experience when we are an anonymous part of the huge crowd. In totemistic thinking, a symbolic displacement takes place. The good and bad spirits are condensed and localized in specific tokens. By means of projective thinking, one's power, misery, and cruelty is transferred and attributed to the totem. The totem, the sacred animal, usually replaces the feared parental figure. The commitment of reality, the adquintio calm, is the final development toward verifying reality. There is a notion of preoccupation and prejudice and a notion of self-limitation, but at the same time a notion of commitment to reality and truth. Mature thinking brings old and verified memories together and tries to integrate them in order to reach a special goal. It takes time for an independent judging inner pilot to be shaped. The first stage of the ego is the product of sensory observation rather than an independent entity. The young inner pilot judges under the coercion of impression from the outside or emotions from inside. Only gradually does this subjective thinking adjust itself to reality, with the pilot being able here to achieve some distance both inner and outer stimuli. Man lives in the world and looks at the world. Creative and uncreative thinking. Creative thinking usually is a solitary process. Original ideas are not built by collective pondering or by group discussion. Although stimulating company and the mutual creative inspiration of a team is able to arouse the urge to creation, the creator needs solitude and then both traditional thoughts and inherited capacity as do for his remolding. No one can work in a thoughtless vacuum, otherwise it will be necessary to live the whole history of human thinking all over again. Thinking is not a spontaneous occurrence in the mind. It is aroused either from the outside by stimulation of the senses or from the inside by the body actions. The stomach thinks, the muscles think, the brain thinks, all the engrams, the memories of facts and argumentations. The memories of facts and argumentation which form our condensed experiences, all of these are thinking too. The creative thinker thinks with his painting hands or with his seeing eyes or with his writing muscles. That is thinking by concentration and abstraction and thinking by free associations, such as by being intuitively receptive of all that touches the sphere of consciousness. The too early imprinting of intellectual concepts, including that of the body control, can so inhibit free associative instinctual thinking that the mind reacts with the obsessive redundancy of the imprinted patterns. These imprints are used automatically without being tested. They can degenerate into compulsive tyrannical dictates inside the mind. Man's creative comprehensions always hovers between the desire for new discovery and the paralyzing inaction of compulsion and redundancy. There exists a skeptical logic which continually verifies observation of the world, but there is also a feast of different scenes of drinking in the world through the eyes. Critical regression. The concept of regressive thinking has been thoroughly demonstrated by social, psychological, and anthropological studies. People do not consistently think on their best level. Even the best philosopher may temporarily abandon logic and experience. Thinking is often an unconscious self-deception used to camouflage rather than face the challenge of the moment. Regression and more primitive levels of thinking are just as much in need of epistemological explanation as are the heights of man's critical capacities. Superstitions and fear can influence the highest intellectual concepts. The battle between conformity to group thinking and the need to assert oneself is continually going on even in the philosophical discussion. The degree of logical judgment of skill in arguing changes continually, dependent on experience, stimulation, tiredness, and disease. Thinking, too, has its acceleration and deceleration of tempo. This does not imply that we should be automatically prejudiced against the so-called infertile, primitive, or philological modes of thinking. Wolff, these analysis modes of speech of non-Western tribes showed that those people who are less biased approach to reality than we have simply because they are not so much stepped into the westernized, too valued way of verbal expression and consequent thinking. Those therapists who treat children have many problems in circumventing the intuitive logic of their young patients. For these youngsters, values are not either or, but are many shades. In this conflict with human communication, a schizophrenic retreats to his own primitive semantics. One such patient always called me Mr. Brabaldo. Gradually, I recognized this as a magic invocation. You will burn eventually in hell. My patient wanted to articulate his determination but was afraid of the eventual magic action of his words. This is why he had to put in a cryptic form. Dissociated thinking. The psychiatrist meets a form of thinking in which the need for verifiability, causality, and relatedness of facts and thoughts allegedly does not exist. It is a way of discontinued thinking in which past concepts are expressed in archaic way. Such confusion can often be used as a defense against having responsibility for one's thoughts. We find this dissociated thinking in many psychotic people, as if several fragments of their minds were not at work at the same time. Many people use the expression, "I am confused," in order to escape the simple consequences of action. In our context, it is important to remember that this form of dissociated thinking can occur in anyone, especially when conscious awareness is hampered. It happens in dreams, when tired, when preoccupied, or in sudden emotional confusion. It happens too in various organic disturbances of the brain. There is a little connection between thought and what is perceived, the facts of reality merely surviving to trigger isolated parts of the former conceptualizations. In its extreme tendency, the observed facts are not comprehended but are incorporated into the existing systems of confusion. This may lie in the root of delusion formation, subjective time, and retrograde causality. In a study of further time, I described how past and present are represented in the structure of human organism. Time patterns leaving their various imprints as mental and physical engrams. In man's reaction to external events, the past is just as alive in him as his actual individual personality. Four main forms of subjective time experience were designated in this study, all of them related to a constructive, formative, and evolutionary principle. This different concept of time embrace stages of gradual development and stem from primarily biological time sense, which is most primitive phase, is able only to recognize a given point on time, is able to recognize a given point on the timeline, that is, Earth time. The evolution toward a feeling of time that measures and evaluates segments of timeline develops secondarily through a confrontation between internal arithmetic functions, external occurrences of the episode's nature. This inner measurement of time span greatly depends on the rhythmic biological processes, and its movement is not comparable to the regular movement of the physical time. The next and higher sense of time, static temporalization, marshals events chronologically along the timeline. The sense of historical succession is, for instance, expressed in ideas of causality. Finally, the most advanced grasp of time involves the consciousness of the dynamic temporalization. Duration, process, continuity. Modern man experiences his continuity, such as with motion pictures and sound recording devices, even though the actual physical process is discontinuous. Our conception of time, which depends first on the psychological functions, becomes at the symbolic level increasingly related to parental images. Further time, the symbol of birth and death, is involved in all our ideas of time. In creative thinking, time is suspended. We are part of the undifferentiated continuum. Time is here identical with the process of life. The passage of time symbolizes the period of separation from the mother and the growing probability of the final death. Frustration in time usually means the missed chance, the missed parental relationship. Too late, too late. Einstein in particular has shown that time cannot be regarded in the absolute sense, flowing from the past to the future. Space is a question of perception, the order of relation of things among themselves. While it is generally agreed that the concept of space is meaningless unless it includes the idea of things occupying space, there is less recognition that the sense of time is also modulus of perceptions. It is an order of events, a relationship between occurrences. Instances point out that the experiences of an individual appear arranged in a series of events. In this series, the single events which are remembered appear to be ordered according to the creation of earlier and later. There exists therefore for the individual an I time or subjective time. This in itself is not measurable. I can, indeed, associate numbers with the events in such a way that the greater number is associated with a later event than with an earlier one. This association I can define by means of clock by comparing the order of events furnished by the clock with the order of the given series of events. We understand by a clock as something which provides events which can be counted. However, the clocks we usually have been geared to our solar system. What we call an hour is actually a measurement in space, or the 15 degrees in the apparent daily rotation of the celestial sphere. As a layman, I am unable to explore the complicated mathematical foundation of the theory of relativity. For the immediate purpose here, it is enough to realize that, to quote Barnett, there is no fixed interval of time independent of the system to which is referred. There is no simple now, and we can only speak of the same now and the same time in relation to the clocks geared at the same astronomical system. In related systems, we cannot talk of events taking place simultaneously. A similar rule is valid for psychological concepts of time, since they too belong to unrelated systems. A patient analyzing the past, let us say, a traumatic event related to forced weaning, analyzes the engrams remaining in the time of analysis, not the past event itself. Even in the human being, we must seek for different simultaneities, for different casualties beside each other, and our task is the more complicated because an absolute physical and psychological frame of reference is still lacking. Returning to the present problem of subjective concept of past and present, the psychologist who investigates a patient can deal only with actual relations between thoughts and feelings in his patients. Even though a memory be projected into the past, it is a memory now and is related to an occurrence and a symptom now. A dream, a conversation, the therapeutic procedure, a thoughts association. As the psychiatrist Bourne has indicated, we may speak only of the symmetric relation in which there are no causes in the strict sense. The effect of an experience may result in the later event, but also may cause the former occurrence to be seen in the new light. In the psychological investigation of subjective experience, one finds that the actual analysis now may change impressions from the past. Though the therapeutic process, the forgotten and the suppressed engram, is brought into awareness so that the painful emotional investment may be eliminated and the event forgotten for good. In the events so investigated, one may speak of a law of reciprocity and the mutual dependency of emotional investment between past and present, and we have reason to accept the fact that when a repressed memory engram becomes conscious, something has changed with the engram at the moment of recall. We may also say in some analytical terms that in therapy the past is reactivated and re-traumatized in order to catch the latent fantasy of the infantile omnipotence. There exists, in that archaic phase, no time perceptions, no lost past, but also the magic conception of the immortal unconscious that help us to conquer the fear of death. Not enough attention is given to the process of memorization as such with its curative effect. Memory makes every past event an occurrence of now. It reduces time to zero. It activates the magic idea of omnipotence that so often seems to be a healing factor, as evidenced in both hypnosis and psychoanalysis. Although knowledge of these relations do not influence the therapist's clinical behavior, it may affect his theoretical viewpoint. Although knowledge of these relations does not influence the therapist's clinical behavior, it may affect his theoretical viewpoint. It helps to explain why so many early traumatic experiences are found and designated as causes in courses of a psychoanalytic procedure. In a world full of events, many relationships and probabilities exist, and this implies many causes of actual event in older sense of the word cause. In a world full of events, many relationships and probabilities exist, and this implies many causes of an actual event in the old sense of the word cause. The world is not chained or misrepresented by therapeutic emphasis on temporal relationships and possible traumatization of the past by present events. The question is whether we can work with the new hypothesis, and this only clinical experience will prove. The given trend of thoughts about retrograde causality may be fortified by our actual clinical experiences of trauma as a temporal event. It is certainly true that later experiences can only lead to neurosis if certain biological peculiarities of the mental apparatus are given. But the later wording of instinct is not experienced by being traced back to the first occasion in which instinctual tensions were felt as disagreeable. The neurosis is often dependent on the falsified repetition of trauma than in the early trauma itself. The primary trauma causes certain conditioning for our memorization. The actual trauma may have mobilized the ancient memory traces. New defense mechanism may overemphasize the past, or the fear of future dangerous reality is warded off by the fantasy that it has happened already. Every serious trauma and shock dramatizes the pre-traumatic life. Every trauma upsets the balance between past and future. The balance between repressed drives and defenses is disturbed. Old mutilation fantasies become aroused with all their implications: fear of death, castration fear. The trauma activates old alarm signals and alarm reactions. Such traumatization of the past can also be unwittingly a result of prolonged and misdirected psychotherapy. Often we have to let the past be the past. In fruitful therapy, old repressed drives return, old emotional scenes become re-emphasized, a general sensitization takes place, and the system of defenses and anticipation is rearranged. The anxiety involved in a new trauma uses the insecurity of the past as defenses in order to avoid future traumatic experiences. This is the way we call the retrograde causality in traumatic experiences: ethics, guilt, and commitment. Since psychotherapy is unwittingly also a form of moral therapy, the therapist being the patient's example in the trial relation called transference, the theory of ethics and the moral commitment is the inherent subject of psychiatric epistemology. Even those practitioners who reject this ethical intrusion into their profession use the inadvertently every time when they describe how a patient should behave. This does not mean, however, the psychiatrist need to take part in the age-old battle about ethical postulates. Whether a theoretical thesis is introduced as the good in a natural foundation of both primitive and corrective morals, that essential differences must be postulated between individual and corrective political ethics. All that, as Protagoras believed, we behave well only by mutual contract. We in our clinical approach must try to see in these different approaches various characterologic affirmations. People can either deceive themselves through their theoretical adherences or live the best they have in themselves. Man, the overdependent, fertilized animal, is because of his dependency needs the greater receptor of prescribed behavior. The acceptor of information, the samina of adapter to rules. Dependency helped man to become an ethical animal. But also because of his dependency on his parents, man's ethical belief and his guilt about transgression of rules acquired an instinctual certainty, the certainty shown by the internalized controlling parent or the ruler commanding him to behave well. Man's wisdom of adaptation to the family and the group became, however, at the same time, the continuation of the errors made by the evolutionary and the historical adaptation of the group and species. Only man's ethical rebellion may lead to a renewed adaptation that either may grow progressively and creatively or become regressive and destructive. Our greatest theoretical concern in man's ambivalent, vacillating attitude toward the moral laws to which he adheres. Man can do the right thing for the wrong reasons and the wrong thing for the right reasons. Man in his conscious life is rather reasonable. It is true, as Spinoza observed, that a will to perfection lives in him. Often, however, unreason combined with the strange will of imperfection and self-destruction wins out. Man is not only a unique evaluating individual, but he also receives impulses for doing good and evil from his environment or from some sovereign or political dictator. Ethical contamination exists in the same way as criminal infections exist. Ethical contamination exists in the same way as criminal infection exists. Man is led by innate laws of good and evil. With Locke, you may say they are divine, or with Vaughan, that they come from the man's biological concerns. Our specific psychiatric problem is the development of man's ethical behavior from infancy to maturity. We observe this relation to parental authority and see that on the basis of early conflicting involvement, the child may develop paradoxical answers to parental moral dictates. Many mediocre terms such as the moral responsibility, accountability, and imputability are etymologically derived from the early training of children and the way we judge their awareness of rules. Being responsible meant originally being able to respond and to verbalize. Imputability from puteri meant originally being able to cleanse oneself. Although this discussion must remain incomplete, I would like to mention several psychiatric aspects usually not taken up in theory of ethics. A continual regression and progression of habits and modes exist in both individual and the collectiveness. In regressive modes, man's moral commitments change. Commitment is here used in the sense of emotional investment and loyal to the self-chosen opinion. A continual contamination with value judgment occurs. Individual and collectivity influences each other mutually. People in the mob can be hypnotized to act against their individual consciences. Mental contagion by delusion values in a reality. The positive side of the statement implies that there only exists a continual contagion with good ethic values. As observed in some of the heroes of the World War II concentration camps, a life dedicated to moral values and steeped in a consistent moral community requires a higher morale and does not break down when its values are attacked. There exists a complicated relation between ends and means. No ethical goal can justify or sanctify evil means. The evil factor, such as violence and criminal intention, will be found out remaining when the goal is reached. Marxist theory believes in the automatic solution of moral problems and wrong means the moment the right ends and the ideal settings are reached. But psychopathology has shown that wrong means deter the ends. People are usually deceived by the fact that what is always works, but this does not mean that it ought to be so. Automatic repetition of the good can itself become psychic defense and defiance of morality. Compulsive ethics can camouflage internal evil. Clinically, we can distinguish on one hand the continual complaining injustice collectors and on the other hand the quarrelsome seekers of the personal rights. Both look for salvation for their hunt egos by devious means. 5. Self-correction and innovation of ethical habits is continually hampered by tradition and taboos. In the matter of ethics, the minority of one can be right. 6. In ethical evaluation, there is the need to blame others for what we ourselves lack in judgment. 7. Every right involves the same time of duty. The dilemma of obedience for the sake of obedience leads to malignant robotism and start early in life. Several German SS officers, for instance, whom I had to investigate during the World War II, committed their horrible crimes in concentration camps out of their automatic submission to the dictator. 8. Even when we can postulate a common ethical behavior based on the golden rule, we are still aware that the self-righteous individual wants to go beyond his mutual contract, beyond the limitation and the restraint imposed by the fellow men. In every group, different values are born, or all some in conflict with individual needs and values. Usually, the law tames and regulates clashes between individuals and corrective evaluation of morals. The law is the common guard of man's unsocial behavior. Psychologically, we ask the law to protect us against our transgressions. 9. So-called moral guidance can be given for evil or for good, for power or for justice. Even therapy can be interest of real care of indifferent coercions. The psychiatric problem of guilt has its specific morbid aspects. Why some people live all their lives with the self-reproaching inner demon, we do not know. There are clinical hunches that this again is connected to the biological symbiotic dependencies need and murderous animal reactions against the threat of separations. The superego represents a guardian against the old violent animal, instincts indulging into the dependency need. The psychiatric evaluation of morals often has no deal with the microcrimes and scalpels, with guilt about heresy, and especially with the literal self-betrayals life forces people into. Psychiatric evaluation of morals often has no deal with the microcrimes and scalps with guilt about heresy, and especially with the little self-betrayals life forces people into. From the very beginning of man's life, a quest of dignity and reserve develops. It is the individualizing drive to bear one's own burden, to go heroically beyond the daily complaints toward the mood of acceptance of both joy and pain. Behind every non-fulfillment of man's self-restraining forces and self-controlling goals hovers guilt. Being unmoral is both transgressing and transcending limitations. This can happen on the lower level and burst out into rape and murder, on a higher level in pride and conceit and mental coercion. End of chapter 7.